That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The British Constitution provides that taxation and representation shall go together. Therefore, women taxpayers are entitled to vote.
I have a dream today. Let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true.
Hello, and welcome to, I guess it's episode 49 of Only Human Podcast. Today, the episode is on a sudden loss of judgment. And it's going to be pretty powerful with some really, really cool examples. And it's something we can all relate to that is not only dangerous to ourselves, but it's dangerous to those around us. So please, listen carefully and think deeply about it as we go through it. Before we get into it, though, I want to talk about our Blue Threat Proverb of the Week, like we often do. And this week it's number 10. And it says, own the decision space between stimulus and response. Own the decision space between stimulus and response. And you can see the text on the poster here that we've got up, that when we don't own it, sometimes our experience, our biases are targeted by emotional triggers, right? Stimuli. Sometimes even our training can get in the way, and we end up surrendering the decision space, and then that renders us unable to think logically, right? It can lead to all kinds of bad things, as we're going to see, including but not limited to tragically poor judgment. So this is kind of a cool one today because a lot of times I talk about nerdy stuff that I have to define, but sudden loss of judgment means pretty much what it says. I'll tell you that it's almost always unexpected. I will tell you that it can affect anyone. And in layman's terms, it's when we do something stupid that we wouldn't normally do. Right? So I guess I'll start with an example probably a lot of us saw. It's when Will Smith at the Oscars slapped Chris Rock, right? If you remember, Chris Rock told a story about Will's wife, and Will took offense to that, went up and slapped him. A lot of people say that was staged. It looked pretty spontaneous to me. So that's an example that he probably regretted. Maybe not, but it's one we can all relate to kick us off. Here's another one that I think we've all probably experienced. More common example of sudden loss of judgment is road rage. Right? I have to be really careful about this because I get angry when somebody cuts me off. Right? I'm usually pretty good at not responding. Others that I drive with, who shall remain unnamed because I'd like to stay married, are not so good. Right? But it goes from you're driving normally, letting people merge and in, and all of a sudden somebody races up and crosses 3 lanes and cuts you off, or even in a parking lot, they race in and steal your parking spot that you were just lining up to back into, and it angers you, right? And when it angers you, it solicits that emotional response. And that's where we get back to this idea of owning the decision space between the stimulus, hey, he cut me off or she cut me off, and the response, I'm going to pull out my gat and end him, right? We have to be extremely careful, especially in this example of road rage. How many times have we seen that escalate, right, into gunplay on our highways and county roads? Especially down here in Texas, where literally everybody that's driving around you probably has a gun in the car. So anyway, just another example and a more common one of what a sudden loss of judgment is. I want to take you on a much bigger example, and one that's been studied a lot. It was the crash of Air France Flight 447. Happened back in, 2009. This flight was en route from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. They took off, leveled off at 35,000 feet. After they leveled off, they ran into some thunderstorm activity that resulted in some moderate and even severe turbulence. If you've ever been on an airplane in severe turbulence, it's scary as hell. So their stress levels were already high, right? Well, to add to this stress, the water moisture formed some ice crystals that plugged something on the outside of the aircraft called a pitot tube. And a pitot tube is just this little narrow tube that sticks into the wind, and it measures the amount of wind coming in, pressure, altitude, all that stuff, and it gives you your airspeed indication. So when ice crystals formed in the pitot tubes, they lost their airspeed indication. That's all they lost. The engines were still running, the aircraft was still flying perfectly, but the autopilot, which was flying the airplane, can't operate without airspeed information, and so it kicked off, right? And that's where it began to snowball. Now, keep in mind they're at 35,000 feet, which is 7 miles over the ocean. They have a lot of time to deal with this. And when the pilots saw the autopilot kick off, they had an emotional response. The situation simply required them to manually fly the airplane, right? Like I said, airplane's still flying perfectly. They just had erroneous airspeed readings. So instead of following the established procedure and getting into the checklist for this kind of emergency, which basically tells you to maintain a stable altitude and power setting, the pilot flying the airplane pulled it into a steep climb. Now the airplane's really in a stall, right? Which means the wings lose lift. And so this decision, which was made in panic, went against the basic principles of airmanship that he was taught, which emphasize keep the plane level when you're not sure what else is going on. So there was a second thing that occurred as a result of this sudden loss of judgment, and that was that the pilots didn't communicate well. They didn't analyze the situation, right? It's important to note that the captain, who was far more experienced than either of the first officers that were on board, had been taking a rest break. And by the time he felt all this going on, he returned to the cockpit. The situation had pretty much deteriorated to the point where he got involved in the confusion and the emotional response as well. So you've got an airplane that's now in an aerodynamic stall, pretty scary for a big airplane, but it's still 7 miles or maybe even a little more since they climbed. And that's a lot of time to recover an aircraft. Right? Now they're getting authentic stall warnings, and yet the pilot just kept pulling back on the stick, worsening the situation as he did so. Simple response to stall recovery is to unload the aircraft, less G's on the airplane, push it over. When you push it over, the wind reattaches to the wings. It starts flying again. But they didn't. For several minutes, they didn't until they hit the ocean, resulting in 228 deaths. So Air France 447 sort of highlights how high stress, confusion, emotion overload can lead to a sudden loss of judgment. And we use this case study in aviation safety training all the time now. It's even given rise to something called startle effect training. Things that happen when you don't expect it, which in many cases, but not all cases, happens as a result of a highly significant trigger in our environment. You know, I guess it was a few years ago, I was accidentally watching Dr. Phil, and he talked about how this same sort of thing, how emotions overpower rational thinking inside of relationships, right? And it seemed to me at the time that this was a bit of an overreach. Right? And then I read about Lisa Nowak. Lisa Nowak is a former NASA astronaut, and she's a classic example of what Dr. Phil was talking about, right? Emotional response in a relationship resulting in a sudden loss of judgment. And this was all over the news for a while. It happened in 2007 when Nowak was involved in a high-profile incident that caught the news, attention of the news, because of who she was, an elite astronaut. She'd flown on the Space Shuttle Discovery. By everyone that they talked to afterwards, she was highly thought of, a logical thinker, extremely professional. But on this particular day, she woke up and drove 900 miles from Houston to Orlando to confront Air Force Captain Colleen Shipman, who apparently, at least in Lisa Nowak's mind, was involved with Nowak's romantic interest, a fellow astronaut named William Offline. It gets weirder, right? Her actions were clearly fueled by emotional distress, right? It's important because this is the kind of person who was trained at an extremely high level in stressful situations. But when it came out of the work environment and into her personal life, she just didn't handle it. During the drive, she brought along pepper spray, a steel mallet, and a disguise, right? Clearly preparing for some sort of confrontation. She even wore, according to reports, adult diapers to avoid having to stop during the long drive. And that was a detail that captured media attention globally. When she got to Orlando, she attempted to confront Shipman in an airport parking lot. And she was extremely aggressive, attempted to spray Shipman with pepper spray, and was arrested before anything worse could happen. So that's pretty out there, right? But it's an example of how even the best professionals, highly trained, disciplined, can experience a sudden loss of judgment under intense personal and emotional pressures. So if Lisa Nowak's training can't prevent her from making impulsive, emotionally driven decisions that are completely out of character, then what hope do we have? Right? Well, that's kind of the purpose of what we're doing here today. I think the more we understand it, and I'll reflect back to the Blue Threat proverb, the more that we can get the space between that stimulus, right? Oh, I'm mad because of somebody cut me off, or somebody's trying to make a move on my romantic partner, or whatever it is. The more we can expand that space, the more opportunity we have to regain our normally good judgment, right? So, just to finish off the Lisa Nowak story, she lost her job, lost her career at NASA, huge public embarrassment. And it just serves as a reminder, if you don't manage these things properly, how they can lead to all kinds of bad things, right? So we know that emotional triggers can result in sudden losses of judgment. If we look at it in our own personal relationships, maybe it's something as simple as an argument with your spouse or child that you don't let go of, right? That triggers you, and now everything that follows is viewed through that bias that you developed over that one fight or that one argument or that one thing that was said or that you said that can never be taken back. The same rules apply. We need to be able to separate that stimulus from our response. But it doesn't always have to be an emotional trigger, right? Our physiology can impact it. Fatigue, for example. According to some studies, up to 200,000 people a year are killed by their doctors due to, I think it's called iatrogenic causes, which means doctor-induced causes. These guys are clearly highly trained, right? They don't kill anybody on purpose, but they also work extremely long hours. right? And think of when you get very, very tired. Do you get snippy? Do you shut down your communications, right? Do you maybe get in a hurry and take shortcuts? Those are all examples of micro sudden losses of judgment. We know that fatigue and poor nutrition and lack of hydration all lead to impaired cognitive functioning, right? So even if there is no emotional trigger, even a smaller trigger, like I've got to finish up this surgery, or I'm going to be late for my grandson's soccer game, can lead to sudden lapses of judgment. Another thing, so far we've talked about emotions and fatigue. Another thing can be overconfidence, right? A lot of times people that have been very successful believe they'll always be successful, right? So they stop evaluating risk in a really good way. I think about financial investors during the early years of the 2000s, before the tech bubble burst, man, people lost everything. Or the fall of Enron, or if you go into politics, you could go into Bill Clinton's sudden loss of judgment with Monica Lewinsky, or Richard Nixon and Watergate. I mean, we go on and on. Right? Probably, I'm looking over at my bookshelf here. I see I've got a Napoleon Bonaparte's biography here. Here was a guy that knew more about warfighting than anybody in the world at the time. I mean, undefeated, and decides he's going to invade Russia in the winter. What? I mean, clearly an ego-driven sudden loss of judgment. Clearly. So these all kind of play out through something we've talked a little bit about before, cognitive biases. And so we'll just kind of toss a couple out there for us to think about. There's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Which basically means we overestimate our own abilities, right? And we tend to underestimate the abilities of others. That can lead us into an ego-driven sudden loss of judgment. Or confirmation bias, where we only look for the things that confirm our beliefs, what we want to believe, right? So maybe there's a lot of good things about our spouse or our kids or whatever, but that one thing that's so stuck in our craw that we're viewing everything through the lens of something that was said 6 months ago, 6 years ago, 6 minutes ago. Another classic example of this sort of cognitive bias was the space shuttle Challenger tragedy, where engineers initially were pretty nervous about the risk of launching during cold weather because they were exceeding the limits of the O-rings. But over time, it was like, it always works. This is fine, right? Right up to the moment when it didn't. Right? So a little bit of nerd explanation of what happens in our brains when we have a sudden loss of judgment. Whenever we perceive something, it comes in through our eyes or our ears or our touch or whatever, we make a snap judgment on risk. Is this something dangerous? And if it's dangerous, how dangerous? Right? This all came down to us through evolution from our caveman days, when somebody would walk around a corner and see a cave bear or a saber-toothed tiger trying to attack them, and they really didn't want to think very much. They needed all the energy in their body to go to muscles and speed and strength, right? So this is called amygdala hijacking, because that part of your brain, little tiny walnut-sized part of your brain, that makes the decision as to how risky this is and what we need to do about it, it's called the amygdala. And if it decides it's really, really, really scary, it shuts down the cognitive functions and the prefrontal lobe of our brain, right? So think back to Lisa Nowak. She saw this as hugely scary, and didn't have access to the normal decision making and judgment that she would have, right? I always like to think of amygdala hijacking as like your brain throws a party, but it's in the wrong room, right? It's like, let's go, all right. Except it's not in the room with the adults. It's in the room with the panicked children. So enough on that. We know that it happens. We kind of know a little bit about how it happens. We've talked about emotions, fatigue. We said that experience and training isn't a real good preventative measure. And we talked a little bit about the neuroscience, but I want to come back to this blue threat proverb. The key to all of these things, how we recover, is to expand the distance between that stimulus and response and have something that we can do inside that time to be able to regain our normally good judgment. Right? So this whole season, we're focusing on Socrates' statement to know yourself, right? And a lot of this type of thinking is taught out by sports psychologists to athletes, right? They know if they're going for a world record or getting ready to run in the finals of the Olympics or whatever it is, that their brains, due to the adrenaline of the moment, aren't going to naturally work as good as they do during their practice sessions or less important meets or events. So they train people to do certain things. And I want to talk about a couple of those. One is, I'll call it a mantra. So there's stimulus. I'm feeling like, oh my, oh my, oh my. I'm getting ready to run 100 against Carl Lewis or whoever it is. Man, that was a long time ago. But or something crazy's happened. This guy cut me off. A mantra is a mental place you go immediately when you recognize it. It might be something as simple as count to 10, count to 3, count to 5, do something. Or in my case, I always like to say, you've thought about this. This is what you're trained for. How are you going to respond? Right? It reclaims your brain from the adrenaline that's flowing out after your amygdala hijack into a normal decision space. Right? And in that short period of time between this has got me really excited and I'm going to do something, I can recover my normal thinking patterns, right? Slow down to go fast, right? You've heard that before. So, two things on how we can prevent and, if we can't prevent, recover from sudden losses of judgment. Thing one, when the trigger happens and you feel the anger or the fear, have somewhere mentally to go. I'll just, keep it simple. Count to 10. Then you actually have to count to 10. You can't just say count to 10, no, I'm pissed, and go back to it. Yeah, count to 10. By that time, maybe that road rage person is gone. By that time, maybe you've had a chance to recollect your wits. Thing two, during that period between stimulus and response, take action to remain calm enough to keep your normal cognitive functions aligned. One of the classic examples from my youth is, I can remember this as if it were yesterday. First time I remember getting stung by a bee. Right? There were bees flying all over the place. I did something stupid. I went to swat something or pick something up, and I got stung on my left arm. Hurts like hell if you've ever been stung like a bee. And it freaked me out. I mean, I went into full panic mode. And because there were other insects flying around in the air, I was like 6 or 7, so, don't imagine grown-up Tony running around screaming. But I literally flew into a panic, and my older brother had to catch me and restrain me and say, it's all right, man. You're not going to get stung anymore. Right? So the lesson from that is that once you have that first hit, you might suddenly view it as, it's going to happen again and again and again and again. It won't, or it probably won't. But if you think it does, it's going to shrink that time between stimulus and response to so small you never recover. So those are the two things. Look for the triggers, have a place to go, and then once you get into that space between stimulus and response, stay there long enough for your normally logical, good thinking to return. So here's how I'd like to kind of wrap this up. I'd like to wrap this up with a challenge to you and ask you to think back about something that you did in the heat of the moment that you wish you hadn't. Maybe 2 or 3 examples. Right? Maybe one professional, one relationship-wise. I've got a couple from my athletic career. And then analyze those from that moment. What was the stimulus? What was the trigger? And then how long was it before you responded? And what could you have done to respond differently if you had this count to 10 mantra, or this is what I'm trained for mantra? I think when you reflect on it in that way, you're going to see the value in everything we've talked about over the last 20, 25 minutes. So that's my challenge to you here today. Now, looking forward, we are going to continue to talk about knowing ourselves. And next time I want to talk a little bit about the art of introspection, how we can look at ourselves to develop things like creativity, to develop things like behavioral health of thinking through and building good habits and defeating bad habits. But first, most importantly, how we can develop the time and the focus that's required for really good, healthy introspection. Sounds nerdy. I promise it won't be. Like always, please follow, share. Sharing's huge on your LinkedIn or your Facebook or your other social media networks. We're trying to build something powerful here. I think we've already gotten a lot of feedback that says we're making a difference. So we want to continue to do that. Next episode 50, big milestone for us. Don't miss it. I'll see you soon.